The first time I noticed something was wrong, it wasn't dramatic. There were no sirens, no shouting, just a quiet unease that settled over the lake like fog. I had moved to this property months ago, dreaming of mornings fishing in the calm waters that stretched wide and clear beyond my dock. But lately, the fish weren't biting. And when I examined the lake, I noticed subtle changes. A faint chemical smell, a strange film on the water, a few dead minnows drifting near the shore. Something was off. I tried to dismiss it. Maybe it was runoff from upstream. Maybe a natural bloom. But the signs were impossible to ignore. Fishing was my routine, my peace, and suddenly it felt threatened. That's when the HOA showed up. It started with a knock at the dock gate. I looked up to see Karen, the HOA president, standing with her clipboard, sunglasses reflecting the morning sun. Behind her were two board members, arms crossed, faces tight with self-righteousness. They didn't greet me. They didn't smile. They marched straight toward the dock like they owned it. "You need to stop fishing immediately," Karen said, voice sharp. "We've received multiple complaints. This lake is off-limits for recreational use, without HOA supervision." I blinked, not quite processing her words. "This lake, I own it," I said slowly, gesturing to the wide stretch of water. "My deed covers this property entirely. You don't have jurisdiction." Karen smirked, as if she expected me to argue. "You think that matters? The HOA oversees safety and water quality. If we say no fishing happens. Rules are rules." Her tone was flat, practiced, the kind used to intimidate people who weren't prepared for a fight. I stepped closer, trying to keep calm. "I've done nothing to violate any safety or environmental regulations. The lake is my property. The fish are mine to catch." Karen leaned on the dock railing, lowering her voice to what she thought was persuasive. "We've been monitoring this lake. It's compromised. Any fishing could be dangerous. For you, for the community. You wouldn't want anyone getting sick, would you?" It was subtle, but my instinct screamed. Compromised. Dangerous. That wasn't a warning. That was a hint. A threat dressed up as concern. I walked along the dock, peering into the water. And that's when I noticed it. A faint rainbow sheen on the surface, the unmistakable sign of chemical contamination. Dead weeds floated alongside the minnows. My stomach sank. The HOA hadn't just restricted me, they had tampered with the lake. "Karen," I said, my voice steady but low, "you didn't just monitor this lake. You poisoned it." Her eyes widened for half a second before she masked it with the same false confidence she always wore. "That's the serious accusation." I didn't back down. "I have records. I can test the water. This isn't safety regulation. This is sabotage." Karen's jaw tightened. She glanced at the two board members flanking her. They looked nervous now, hesitant. Authority only works if everyone believes it's legitimate, and for the first time, doubt flickered in their eyes. I pulled out my phone and took a sample of the water. "I'll be sending this to environmental authorities. And make no mistake, any further interference with my property or the lake will be documented." Karen swallowed hard, hiding a flash of panic behind her sunglasses. She backed toward the board members. We just want to protect the community." I shook my head. "You think you're protecting anyone. You don't realize the full impact. This lake isn't just my property. It supplies water downstream, water you rely on." Her confident mask faltered. That moment, that hesitation, told me everything. She didn't know. She didn't realize that by trying to control me, she had put everyone at risk, including herself. And just like that, the confrontation changed. This wasn't just about fishing anymore. This was about power, control, and consequences. The lake lay still, silent witness to the battle that had just begun. The morning after the confrontation, I woke early, coffee in hand, standing on my dock, staring at the lake with a sense of urgency. The water wasn't just murky. It was dangerous. Something the HOA had done was intentional, and it was no longer about control. It was about recklessness. Every ripple reminded me that people downstream relied on this water. The irony wasn't lost on me. The very group claiming to protect the community had endangered it. I started by documenting everything. Photos of the rainbow sheen on the water. Samples of dead plants and fish. Video recordings of the lake's surface and the docks. Each piece of evidence was meticulous, time-stamped, undeniable. Karen and her board might think intimidation and bureaucratic tricks would work, but proof didn't lie. By mid-morning, the HOA's usual traffic picked up. Karen arrived again, this time accompanied by a lawyer, clipboard in hand, and an entourage of homeowners who looked equally anxious. She approached with the same bravado, trying to act as if nothing had changed. "You shouldn't be collecting samples," she said, voice clipped, almost offensive. "This is an HOA matter." I didn't respond immediately. I let her look around, taking in the docks, the water, the clear, private property signs I had put up after the first encounter. My calm presence seemed to unsettle her more than any argument could. "They're poisoned," I said finally, breaking the silence. "And you don't even realize the extent. This isn't just about stopping me from fishing. You've compromised your own water supply downstream." Her eyes flicked toward the horizon, her composure faltering. That split-second glance told me she hadn't considered the consequences. She hadn't thought beyond the immediate goal of exerting control. "Stop making accusations," she hissed. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I do," I replied firmly. "I have documentation, I have samples, and I will be contacting environmental authorities. Any further interference with my property or this lake will have consequences, legal consequences." For the first time, she hesitated. Her board members shifted uncomfortably behind her. One whispered to another, the tone hushed but tense. Even in her circle, doubt had begun to creep in. The next step was notifying the proper authorities. By noon, the Environmental Protection Office was on the line. I explained what I had observed, the samples I had taken, and the ongoing interference from HOA officials. They took the matter seriously. This wasn't a simple land dispute. It was a public safety issue. I spent the afternoon coordinating with inspectors who arrived within hours. They tested the water independently, compared it to my samples, and began documenting a chain of contamination. Karen and her team were forced to wait on the shore, unable to stop the process. The authorities' presence changed the dynamic entirely. Her confident, arrogant posture melted into impatience, then worry, then frustration. By evening, Karen was visibly rattled. Her attempts to assert authority had failed, her narrative unraveling with every test result. I watched as she argued quietly with her board, trying to reframe her story, but facts don't bend to intimidation. That night, I walked the length of my dock alone. The lake reflected the sunset in fiery streaks. Calm and quiet, yet charged with the knowledge that control had shifted. The HOA's assumptions of power had collided with reality, and reality was on my side. The first day of the battle was over, but the stakes had grown higher. What had started as a fight over fishing rights had transformed into a confrontation over safety, authority, and accountability. Karen's attempt to intimidate me had inadvertently put her entire community at risk, and now she had no idea how far the consequences would reach. The lake, as still as ever, waited. And so did I. The following morning, I woke to a quiet that felt unnatural. The lake, which usually hummed with life, birds, frogs, the gentle slap of water against the docks, was eerily still. The impact of the previous day's events was already rippling through the community. Word of the contamination had spread. Karen's initial bravado was nowhere to be seen. Instead, there was tension, whispered speculation, and a sense of growing fear among the HOA members who had once stood so confidently at my dock. I spent the morning reviewing water test results with the environmental inspectors. The independent analysis confirmed my worst suspicions. Toxins had been introduced into the lake, concentrations high enough to endanger fish populations and potentially affect downstream water sources. Every data point strengthened my position, but it also made the stakes painfully clear. This was no longer about fishing privileges. It was about accountability, safety, and exposing the HOA's reckless behavior. By mid-morning, Karen returned, flanked by a small group of loyal board members. But her confident stride had faltered. She walked like someone who had been forced to rethink her plan on the fly. Her clipboard, once a symbol of authority, now felt more like a prop she clutched desperately. "You're making this personal," she accused, stepping onto my dock with caution. "This is about the community's safety." I met her gaze evenly. "No, Karen. This is about facts. Safety is exactly why I've involved the authorities. Your actions have already compromised it." Her mouth opened and closed, searching for a comeback. I didn't give her one. Instead, I handed over my compiled water test results, labeled and time-stamped. These documents, combined with independent testing, show exactly what happened. Any further interference will be treated as intentional endangerment and trespassing. Her eyes widened slightly, betraying a flicker of panic. She had expected me to argue or back down. She hadn't expected calm, methodical preparation backed by evidence. For the first time, she faced authority she couldn't intimidate, couldn't manipulate, and couldn't spin to her favor. Behind her, her board members shuffled uncomfortably. Some avoided eye contact. One whispered, clearly questioning the decisions that had led them to this point. Karen's confident narrative was crumbling, replaced by uncertainty. By afternoon, the county environmental team arrived with additional testing kits and equipment. They moved with quiet efficiency, documenting everything while Karen and her team hovered on the shore, powerless. Every sample, every reading, every observation became an unassailable record of the HOA's reckless interference. The irony wasn't lost on me. The very water supply Karen had tried to control was now the instrument of her exposure. Every test confirmed that tampering with my lake had threatened not just my property, but the community she claimed to protect. Karen's demeanor changed rapidly. Frustration turned to anger, anger to panic. Her attempts to persuade the inspectors or influence their assessment were subtle at first, then desperate. The officials, however, remained neutral, professional, and unwavering, exactly what Karen could not control. By evening, I stood on the dock again, watching the lake reflect the fading sunlight. The water shimmered like liquid gold, seemingly indifferent to the chaos unfolding around it. Karen had retreated to the far side of the property, muttering to her board members. Her authority was gone. Every tactic she had used to intimidate or dominate me had been neutralized by preparation, evidence, and law. The first wave of confrontation had ended, but the stakes had only grown. Karen's actions had crossed the line from harassment to potential public safety violations, and she had no idea how deep the consequences would run. The lake was still mine. My rights were clear. And the HOA, for all its bluster, was starting to realize that control is meaningless without legitimacy. As the sun dipped below the treeline, casting long shadows across the water, I felt a sense of calm determination. The battle wasn't over, but for the first time, I knew the outcome. Facts, preparation, and law would always outmatch arrogance, entitlement, and ignorance. The lake reflected the sky in perfect silence, waiting for the next move. And I was ready. The next few days felt surreal, like watching a slow-motion collapse from the comfort of my own property. Karen had tried everything: calls to board members, emails filled with threats, posts in community forums, but each attempt only highlighted her recklessness. The water tests had gone public to the extent permitted by the authorities, and now, everyone who mattered knew what had happened. Karen's confidence began to fracture. The board members who had once stood silently behind her now whispered among themselves, clearly questioning her leadership. One of them even sent an anonymous message to the environmental team confirming prior complaints about unusual lake activity. Every step she took seemed to amplify her own exposure. By midweek, a formal notice arrived from the county environmental office. It was concise and legal in tone. Any further contamination or interference with the lake would result in immediate enforcement action. That meant fines, citations, and potential personal liability for anyone involved. Karen read it, her face pale beneath her sunglasses. The authority she had wielded for months, arrogantly, carelessly, was now staring her down, undeniable and immovable. She attempted one last tactic, a public inspection event, to intimidate me and reassert her control. Residents were encouraged to come to the docks, wave their presence, and show solidarity. It was supposed to feel overwhelming, a show of numbers. It failed spectacularly. The moment residents arrived, county inspectors, fully briefed and professional, were already measuring water, recording readings, and taking samples. Karen tried to direct them, insisting they look at specific areas, but the inspectors were immune to her bluster. The residents quickly realized this was not a rally, it was a legal investigation. Slowly, quietly, they dispersed. Karen was left standing alone on the shore, frustrated, flustered, powerless. Inside the HOA, the fallout was just as severe. Emails circulated between board members, questioning why proper procedures had not been followed. Minutes of prior meetings were reviewed. Karen's unilateral decisions were documented, showing repeated overreach and misrepresentation of authority. The board realized that their actions, blindly following her lead, could expose them to liability. I didn't intervene. I didn't need to. Everything I had done, collecting evidence, documenting the contamination, coordinating with authorities, was now working in my favor. The lake, once a battleground, had become an instrument of truth. Karen tried contacting me directly, pleading, negotiating, attempting to sound reasonable. "Let's talk," she wrote in a message. "We can find a compromise. This doesn't have to go further." I ignored it, not out of malice, but because compromise requires honesty, and she had already demonstrated a disregard for truth and safety. There would be no negotiation until she acknowledged her actions. By the end of the week, the authorities had issued a final notice confirming my ownership of the lake and the legal enforcement of my property rights. Any future interference by Karen or the HOA would be treated as trespassing with potential civil and criminal consequences. The docks were quiet. The lake was calm. Residents who had once used the area indiscriminately now respected the boundaries clearly marked. Every sign, every locked gate, every posted notice reinforced what I already knew. Control without legitimacy is nothing. Karen's power was gone. She no longer controlled the narrative, the residents, or the lake. The once formidable figure who had stormed my property days earlier was now reduced to a cautionary tale, an example of arrogance clashing with law, preparation, and undeniable evidence. Standing on my dock at sunset, watching the water reflect the fiery streaks of the sky, I felt a profound sense of relief. The battle wasn't about winning a fight. It was about enforcing boundaries, protecting property, and ensuring safety. Karen had learned, painfully, publicly, that entitlement and intimidation can never replace legality and truth. The lake lay still, pristine, indifferent. The only movements were the gentle ripples, a reminder that nature continues regardless of human folly. And this time, I controlled what mattered, quietly, firmly, and without dispute. By the following week, the lake had returned to a sense of normalcy, or as normal as it could be after the chaos Karen had created. The water shimmered under the morning sun, ripples dancing across the surface, completely undisturbed by unauthorized boats or frantic trespassers. The air smelled fresh again, untainted by chemicals or the tension that had gripped the shoreline. For the first time in days, I could fish without fear, without anxiety, and without feeling watched. Karen's presence had all but disappeared. The HOA board had quietly distanced themselves from her. Emails circulated acknowledging her overreach and documenting her mismanagement, but they never mentioned her directly. Protocol dictated careful language. I heard from a neighbor that several board members had resigned quietly, citing concerns about liability and authority mismanagement. It was a domino effect. Karen's arrogance had not only endangered the lake, but also dismantled the fragile support she had relied on for years. The County Environmental Office issued a final report confirming that the contamination was intentional and traced to actions aligned with HOA interference. The report explicitly stated that any future attempts to manipulate the lake or restrict access illegally would result in immediate enforcement. The HOA, for the first time, realized that their actions could carry real consequences, and they were forced into a position of compliance. I spent that afternoon walking the length of my dock, checking the water, tying down my boat, and ensuring the shoreline was secure. Residents who had previously trespassed now approached cautiously, often stopping to wave rather than crossing boundaries. Some apologized quietly, acknowledging their ignorance or lack of understanding about the property lines. I nodded politely. Confrontation was no longer necessary. Respect, not fear, had finally taken hold. The true irony of the situation struck me when I considered Karen's actions. She had tried to assert control by poisoning the lake, intending to intimidate me into compliance. Instead, her attempt exposed her negligence, risked public health, and completely undermined the HOA's credibility. The very water she had tried to use as leverage became the instrument of her downfall. By evening, the lake was bathed in golden sunlight. The docks were secure, the signs were visible, and the water was clear. The only movement came from fish breaking the surface occasionally and birds gliding overhead. I set up my fishing gear, feeling a sense of calm and accomplishment. This wasn't just about catching fish. It was about reclaiming peace, asserting rights, and demonstrating that preparation and evidence always trump arrogance and entitlement. I thought about Karen, wherever she was, likely realizing that her authority had evaporated. For years, she had relied on intimidation, momentum, and manipulation. None of that mattered now. Authority without legitimacy is fragile, and hers had collapsed completely. As I cast my line into the lake, the weight of the past week lifted. The HOA's attempts to control, to intimidate, and to manipulate had failed. The property, the water, and the docks were under my protection and control. Every sign I had posted, every document I had filed, every sample I had taken had contributed to a clear message. Boundaries exist, and violations have consequences. The sun began to set behind the trees, painting the lake in shades of orange and red. A gentle breeze stirred the surface, carrying away the remnants of conflict. The lake, calm and steadfast, reflected the sky perfectly, indifferent to human folly, yet offering a lesson in patience and perseverance. For the first time in weeks, I felt completely at peace. Karen's threats, the intimidation, and the chaos had no power over me or the property. The lake remained mine, the dock secure, and the rules clear. Control, once challenged by evidence and law, had been restored, and with it came the quiet satisfaction of justice served. Sometimes I thought, it doesn't take loud confrontation to win. It takes patience, preparation, and knowing exactly what you control. The lake was a reminder of that truth. Calm, clear, and unstoppable, just like the water itself.